Hello and welcome. I'm Nadira Tudor and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. Russia claims Ukraine has struck them with US long-range missiles 1,000 days since the start of the invasion, as Vladimir Putin approves an updated nuclear doctrine. It comes as President Zelensky pushes the European Parliament to continue their support and put more pressure on Moscow. In the United States, Donald Trump announces plans to use the country's military to carry out the largest mass deportation of illegal migrants in US history. And 45 pro-democracy activists are jailed in Hong Kong in the region's biggest national security trial as they're accused of attempting to overthrow the government. To our top story now. Ukraine has fired the US-approved long-range missiles into Russia, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. RIA Novosti says 6 missiles hit the Bryansk region overnight, with 5 shells shot down. It comes on the 1,000th day since Russia invaded Ukraine. For more on this, I'm joined from Moscow by our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova. Dasha, we're hearing reports from Moscow that Ukraine have already used the long-range missiles to hit Russia in the Bryansk region. How worrying is this report?
Well, indeed, it is the first time that the US-supplied ATACMS missiles have been used against the Russian sovereign territory, especially since the announcement of this permission has been made. We understand that 6 ATACMS missiles have been fired by the Ukrainian side, 5 have been intercepted, and the debris of the 6th one have fallen on the area of the military object in Russia's Bryansk region. No damage or casualties have been reported, but it is indeed a worrying signal. We have heard the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirming that this strike actually means that the US wants escalation, because from Russia's perspective, giving Ukraine the permission to strike Russia with the long-range US-supplied missiles is only meaning that it is the US that is striking Russia, because from Russian perspective, it is obvious that it is simply impossible for the Ukrainian officers to operate these type of weapons on their own.
Now, it has been quite a reaction, hasn't it, Dasha? Vladimir Putin to Joe Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use their long-range missiles on Russian soil, and he took his time to announce the changes to the nuclear doctrine. Tell us more.
Well, indeed, the Russian president has signed on a decree which provides for the revision of Russia's nuclear doctrine, and it has a much more detailed number of cases and triggers, so to say, when Russia could use its nuclear deterrence. So we understand from the updated text that against the version of 2020, Russia could actually use its nuclear weapons in case of a joint attack by a non-nuclear state that is supported by a nuclear country, and this is a change from the previous edition. We also understand that Moscow will be possibly using its nuclear deterrence in an attack of the large-scale attack against Russia with the use of drones or missiles, and that it will also be seen as the possible trigger. We also understand from the new edition that Russia will engage in nuclear deterrence against those countries that offer their territory, maritime zones, airspace and resources for aggression against Russia. However, it is not really clear whether this will definitely mean that Russia will inevitably use its nuclear weapons in case such attack actually takes place. It also mentions the uncertainty of scale, of time and place of possible use of nuclear deterrent. But what Russia is trying to say with the update of this doctrine is that it is not new. Russia has been talking about it ever since the talk of the permission to Ukraine to use long-range weapons has started. And Russia has sent very clear that it is a signal, and the hope is is that the Western countries will carefully study all the provisions of the upgraded nuclear doctrine and will think twice before actually striking Russia with those long-range weapons, because Moscow says any attack against the Russian territory will not be left unanswered.
Given that the words and the rhetoric is extremely strong, and obviously the actions of changing that doctrine as well, this change that would make Russia's leadership consider a nuclear strike, that will be sending shockwaves throughout the international community. What measures have been put in place to ensure a catastrophe, should there ever be that, can be avoided?
Well, from the Russian perspective, the only way to avoid a catastrophe is to be responsible, and Moscow says it is still adhering to the principle of avoiding a nuclear escalation and a nuclear war. So Russia says it has always viewed the use of its nuclear weapons as the means of deterrence, as the last resort measure. So the hope here in the Russian capital is that it will not come to the point when Russia will still have to use this type of weapons. Having said that, Moscow is still sending a very strong message to the Western countries. Also, we've heard the Russian foreign minister actually welcoming the decision by Germany not to send its towers to Ukraine, not to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with their long-range weapons. So Russia is trying to make it clear to the Western countries that it has something to respond with in case the Western countries try to escalate. But an important point here to keep in mind that this is the permission that is being granted by the outgoing administration, and the hope, at least among the political analysts and military specialists here in the Russian capital, is that actually the situation will not deteriorate to the point when Donald Trump comes to power and there will be nothing left to repair.
Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you for the update. Changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine have come as a direct result from the United States' decision to grant Ukraine permission to use US long-arm missiles. Yesterday, the Kremlin gave a warning that Moscow would respond and accused the West of playing with fire by probing the limits of what a nuclear power might or might not tolerate. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Boris Bondarev, former Russian counselor on arms control at the Russian diplomatic mission in Geneva, who resigned from his position in May 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine a few months before. Welcome to the programme, Boris. Now, in response to Ukraine providing the go-ahead to use long-range missiles and their subsequent use in Russia's Bryansk region, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, "We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we will react accordingly." What do you suspect this reaction will involve?
Well, we should look at previous precedents, which we have many, starting from the very beginning of the invasion, when on February 24th, President Putin said that in case of any other country would try to interfere, Russia would respond with all means, whatever it sees fit. Of course, hinting at nuclear weapons. And he keeps threatening with his nuclear weapons ever since. And the Western countries interfered. They started supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons. And then it was HIMARS systems, then it was long-range missiles. It was a lot of other modern weapons. And each time when the Western countries, NATO and United States, have crossed this another red line, Russia threatened them with nuclear weapons. It's been on the table since the day one, and they still pursuing this agenda. So there is nothing new in this yesterday's amendments into the Russian nuclear doctrine. It's all good rhetoric aimed at deterring the Western countries from multiplying, from intensifying their military support to Ukraine.
Boris, I suppose from the international community's perspective, it's about what the Russian red line is, and are they reasonable red lines? In your opinion, are they reasonable red lines?
Well, to discuss about Putin's red lines, it is important to understand what this entire war is about. This entire war is about preserving Putin's regime of his personal power over Russia. And he wants to exclude any possibility to undermine his power. And the main threat to his power in Russia, and the only threat, as he considers it, is the threat that coming from the West. He believes the Western countries are bent to undermining, diminishing, and overthrowing him. Whatever paranoid it may seem, but Putin and his closer circle, they are all about this. So they want to stop it. They want to put the Western world, United States, first of all, to their place. So they know that this is sphere of influence of Putin, like Russia, Ukraine, the former Warsaw Pact, perhaps, that no other country has the right to interfere. That's why he started this war. It's war to reestablish his unique position. So what are his reasonable red lines? His only red line is to stay in the Kremlin, to stay at power, and he will do whatever he sees fit to achieve it. Also, he doesn't want to die. He's not a fanatic. He's not a religious, leader. He's not a prophet. He's just a corrupted dictator who wants to live the rest of his life in his villas, in his palaces, with his friends, with his grandsons and all. So all he has to do now, it is to threaten the Western countries from supporting Ukraine, hoping that this support will stop when Donald Trump comes into office, and then Ukraine will surrender eventually. Maybe in 1 month, in 2 months, in 3 months, Putin is quite confident that he may prevail in this war because the West seems to allow him to prevail in this war, despite the Western interests, of course. But if Putin can be forced to use nuclear weapons, theoretically, yes, but it would be very much of suicide to him, and he understands it.
Boris, I mean, you've mentioned some really strong phrases there, which, from the outside looking in, and obviously from the inside, because you were on the inside, are extremely worrying. So, you're saying that he's paranoid, it's a corrupt dictator, and this is what the war about. But there's a nuclear threat, isn't there? How likely is it that that button will be pressed?
Well, this is a question of Putin's psyche, I would say. It's not about the doctrine, because if it comes to the point that Putin and his generals gather somewhere and think about using nuclear weapons for real, they will never recall that there is some kind of doctrine. They will never look into it and look for whether the doctrine allows them to strike nuclear bomb on Ukraine or another country or not. Of course not. They will be thinking only if the nuclear strike will be beneficial to them at this very point, at this very moment. So it's only up to them. And of course, there is no foolproof. The Russian system is so personalist. It is so designed to cater to the wishes of one man. So there is no foolproof, there is no checks and balances. And unfortunately, if Putin decides to use nuclear weapons, there will be 99% that there will be no resistance, no sabotage, no nothing, they will do it. So the question is how to make him not to decide so. And that is why I believe that he must be confronted with the might and resilience and resolve from both Ukraine and its Western partners. They must tell Putin unequivocally that don't even dare thinking about nuclear weapons, because retaliation will be, so to speak. Because today, Putin may have a lot of reasons to suspect that if he uses nuclear weapons, there will be no retaliation, that the Western countries will be so afraid, and the Western leaders will be so afraid of this, that they will just retreat and say, okay, we don't know anything. We don't want to be part of this. We don't want to get involved. Okay, get Ukraine, get whatever you want. Just don't do it, with us. And he has many reasons, because the Western leaders are behaving right now in this fashion.
Boris Bondarev, former Russian Counselor on Arms Control. It's been really great to have you on the programme. Thank you for your opinions. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Earlier today, Volodymyr Zelensky pressured the European Parliament to push Moscow harder towards a just peace. Speaking on the 1,000th day since the Russian invasion, the Ukraine president thanked the leaders in Brussels for their support and asked for their continued help. Here's what he had to say.
Putin remains smaller than the united strength of Europe. I urge you not to forget this, and do not forget how much Europe is capable of achieving. And if we could stop Europe's way of life from falling, then we can surely push Russia towards a just peace.
For more on this, I'm joined from Brussels by our correspondent, William Denslow. William, we've just seen a short clip of President Volodymyr Zelensky remotely addressing the MEPs. What else did he say?
Well, there was a huge message of thanks from Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky, saying that for 1,000 days the European Union had stood side by side with Kiev. But he urged the EU to not stop there, to continue to do what they can to provide support for Kiev in its war with Russia. That was a very strong sentiment. Vladimir Zelensky also made a veiled reference to the US elections, urging European allies not to be distracted by elections. Of course, that a veiled reference to Donald Trump and concerns that are certainly shared in Brussels about what this impact of the Trump presidency could have for continued support for Ukraine going forward. So President Zelensky very much urging European allies to stay the course and do what they can to continue providing support for Ukraine. This comes in a week where Vladimir Zelensky has also made strong references to the use of long-range weaponry to be used to strike targets deep into Russian territory. Volodymyr Zelensky saying that words are not enough and that missiles speak for themselves. So then very much a message for European allies to follow the lead of the Biden administration in Washington and to give their approval for these weapons to be used for Ukraine as they see fit.
Now, as we've mentioned, it's been 1,000 days since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, and the European Parliament is marking the date in the form of a special summit. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what they're promising?
Absolutely. Well, there was a huge show of support for Ukraine's president, a long-standing ovation for Ukraine's president as he addressed the parliament here in Brussels, although it must be said that Volodymyr Zelensky was addressing it remotely. However, that didn't stop many parliamentarians, many MEPs from getting to their feet and applauding Ukraine's president. Many, including the president of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, commending his bravery, his courage, as well as a leader, but also the bravery of the Ukrainian people over this last 1,000 days, saying that they have been an inspiration around the world. There was a strong show of support from many MEPs and many of the European parties. We heard from Manfred Weber, the head of the EPP, the largest political group here in Brussels in the European Parliament. Now, Manfred Weber said that what we needed going forward was peace through strength, not concessions. He said it was up to the EU to follow Washington's lead and approve these long-range missiles to be used. That was a sentiment shared by many, but important to note that this isn't a universal support. Some on the far right of the political spectrum here in Brussels even boycotted the event, having their own event outside of Brussels. So not even all MEPs were at this event. And we also, from some on the right that did attend here in Brussels, we heard from Kinga Gál, who represents Patriots for Europe. Now, she condemned Russia's act of aggression, as she put it, but she said that saving lives must be a priority and the focus should be on achieving a ceasefire as quickly as possible.
Thank you, William Denslow in Brussels. US President-elect Donald Trump has confirmed he plans to declare a national emergency and use the military to carry out mass deportations. As many as 11 million people are thought to be living in the US illegally, but there are concerns forcing out such a large proportion of America's workforce could lead to major economic problems, as Nick Harper reports from Washington.
Day one in office will be D-Day for mass deportations. Donald Trump confirming US policy, as he did through so much of his first term, via social media. Replying to a conservative commentator on Truth Social, Trump simply wrote it was true military assets would be used for a mass deportation program. Millions are preparing for the threat of deportation, while lawmakers in states like Arizona are stepping up plans to secure the US-Mexico border.
Protecting our border is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It is an Arizona and an American issue. And that's why I will work with anyone to secure our border. Just as I worked with this current administration to launch Task Force SAFE, I will work with the next one to deliver border security.
It's still unclear how Trump will carry out the deportations or the legality of such a move. Legal challenges are expected. It's projected the plan will cost billions of dollars to implement, while stripping millions of workers from the workforce will cause GDP to shrink by more than $1 trillion.
I'll make an announcement.
The deportation plan is playing out amid a courtroom battle that's captured headlines and Trump's attention. 22-year-old Laken Riley was killed in the state of Georgia earlier this year. On Monday, a Venezuelan undocumented migrant went on trial for her murder. Trump has used the case to argue the current government's border policy has failed. Figures suggest border officials have stopped more than 10 million migrants entering the US during the almost 4 years of Joe Biden's administration. Immigration was a clear vote winner for Donald Trump, helping to propel him back to the White House. Now he's expected to announce a slew of executive actions within hours of walking back into office on January the 20th. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's take a look at some of the other top stories making news around the world. More than 200 children have been killed in Lebanon in the last 2 months, according to the UN children's agency UNICEF. Those deaths correlate with Israel's escalation attacks on Hezbollah. During a press briefing in Geneva, a UNICEF spokesperson said, "For the children of Lebanon, it has become a silent normalization of horror." Donald Trump has selected former Fox business presenter Sean Duffy as his transport secretary. Duffy, a former Wisconsin congressman, has been a loyal supporter of the president-elect and, if successful, will be put in charge of a $110 billion annual budget across aviation, rail and automotive policies. Gisèle Pelicot, the woman at the centre of France's mass rape trial, has been giving her final statement in the city of Avignon today. Her ex-husband, Dominique Pelicot, who is on trial alongside 50 others, has admitted putting sleeping pills in his wife's food before abusing her, before recruiting groups of men to sexually assault her. A verdict is expected on the 20th of December. Marius Borg Høiby, the son of Norway's crown princess, has been arrested on suspicion of rape. The 27-year-old, who has no royal titles or duties, was arrested in Oslo late last night. He denies the allegations. And huge crowds have taken to the streets in Wellington, New Zealand, to support Maori rights. They're protesting a colony law that could alter the country's treaty between Maori people and the British monarchy. Today, a Hong Kong court jailed 45 pro-democracy activists for up to 10 years following a landmark national security trial that's damaged the city's once feisty democracy movement and drawn criticism from the US and other countries, as Laura Westbrook reports.
Hundreds of people gathered at court today, many having camped overnight to be there to witness the culmination of the city's largest national security trial. In court, the national security judge took around 10 minutes to read out the sentences, going by number rather than by name. Now, some of the defendants had waved to their loved ones in the gallery, and it was emotional when the sentences were read out. We heard some gasps in the courtroom when they finally learned of their fate. The sentences ranged from more than 4 years to 10 years, the harshest sentence going to former law professor Benny Tai. He pled guilty to the charge of conspiracy to commit subversion, and he had faced up to life in prison. He got around a third off for pleading guilty, and he was named as the unofficial organizer of a primary vote that took place in July of 2020 to pick candidates for elections later that year. There were warnings from the government that the vote contravened the Beijing-imposed national security law, but it was held anyway, and prosecutors accused the activists of plotting to undermine the government and force then leader Carrie Lam to resign by aiming to win a majority in the Legislative Council and using it to block budgets. Now, organisers had argued that their actions were allowed under the Basic Law, which is Hong Kong's mini-constitution, but the three national security judges said this plan would have caused a constitutional crisis. And this has been a lengthy legal process. Many of the defendants have been in jail for more than 3 years. Joshua Wong, who was the face of the Umbrella movement in 2014, was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months. Loved ones and family members were in court today, including the wife of former lawmaker known as Long Hair Leung, who was jailed for 6 years and 9 months. Now, Chan Po-ying said she felt calm when she heard of the sentence of her husband because she was under no illusion that he would be released soon. Now, we have heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Li Jiang, who told reporters that no one can engage in illegal activities in the name of democracy. Now, Beijing imposed the national security law in 2020 in the wake of the 2019 anti-government protests, and the government has said that it's restored order and stability in the city. But critics say it's transformed Hong Kong and it has been used to crush dissent and the opposition. Now, I spoke to Maya Wang from Human Rights Watch, and she told me that for those who work in this space or who participated in the pro-democracy movement, that they were saddened by the sentencing. She said that people in Hong Kong have grown up watching debates in LegCo or even running for election, and now trying to win a majority in an election can land you in prison. She said the harsh sentences show how much Hong Kong's civil liberties have been erased. Laura Westbrook for Al Arabiya News, Hong Kong.
Let's take a look at some of the top business news. US aerospace manufacturer Boeing will cut more than 2,500 jobs in the states of Washington, Oregon, South Carolina and Missouri as part of its cost-saving mission to lay off 10% of its workforce. Over 2,000 of those affected are tasked with building commercial airliners. Food and drink giant Nestle has announced efforts to increase its advertising and marketing budget after a $2.8 billion cost-cutting drive. It's hoped the plan will increase the company's growth, an idea put forward by new CEO Laurent Freaks, who took over in September. The weight loss drug Wegovy has been launched in China this week after approval was given by health authorities earlier this year. It's thought that the maker's Novo Nordisk will charge 1,400 yuan for 4 injections. More than 180 million live with obesity in China. The country is also the world's second largest pharmaceutical market. To sport now, and Live Golf star Sergio Garcia has confirmed he will rejoin the DP World Tour for the 2025 season for a chance to play at next year's Ryder Cup. He's the event's record point scorer and is looking to match Lee Westwood and Sir Nick Faldo's European record of 11 appearances at the biennial competition. It's thought the Spanish golfer has now settled his debts after being fined for leaving the DP World Tour to join Live Golf. And the Honduras football team will play their next home game behind closed doors after Mexico's coach Javier Aguirre was hit by a beer can at the country's clash during the Nations League quarter-final. The Confederation of North Central American Caribbean Association Football says that Honduras failed to implement adequate stadium security measures. Let's remind you of our top stories. Russia claims Ukraine has struck them with US long-range missiles 1,000 days since the start of the invasion, as Vladimir Putin approves an updated nuclear doctrine. It comes as President Zelensky pushes the European Parliament to continue their support and put more pressure on Moscow. In the United States, Donald Trump announces plans to use the country's military to carry out the largest mass deportations of illegal migrants in US history. And 45 pro-democracy activists are jailed in Hong Kong in the region's biggest national security trial as they're accused of attempting to overthrow the government. That's all from us on W News. Thanks for joining us. Tom Burges Watson is coming up with GNT. Good night.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No. The Democratic Party lost its way. They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake because Harris, while a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2019 she failed, 2020 she failed again in 2024. the analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. They got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy.
Yeah, the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at 11 to 12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't mess around.
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans, AAA players, that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government, because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work. because my family, is American and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day. And this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds. Because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric, weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules, and they never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I point that out is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you ride against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the supreme leader goes, oh, my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there, squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding. I want to work out and be part of the, reciprocal tariff act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He's just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's, excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. Now we want to stop. Because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the supreme leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And you believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal, you can't use their courts. A good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the US, the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it,
I would.
a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great, it depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I'd pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because, remember, they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the supreme leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So again, squeezing the supreme leader's head there is good, and it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the supreme leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just, somebody has to stop this.
Exactly, and on a human level, but as well as
obviously
markets. So it affects the bread and butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether Trump's successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing. So we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach 200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think, and you don't have to do this, I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector. You're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. In terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a Moser, a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support. The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no longer a collector.
Penny for an O'Leary band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So they don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
on Shark Tank.
Yeah, the whole thing is, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit Show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
Paris, the world's most romantic city. People love it for its culture, fashion, architecture, and food, and is considered the dream destination of many. The French capital has some of the most beautiful and historic buildings and monuments. The most famous of all is the Eiffel Tower, one of the most iconic constructions in the world. There's the Arc de Triomphe at the end of the Champs-Élysées. The Notre Dame Cathedral, which dates back to 1163, is the most visited attraction. Located high above the city in Montmartre is the Sacré-Cœur Basilica. And of course, the Louvre Museum, which contains the Mona Lisa and many other works of art. Don't forget the La Conciergerie, famous as a prison, a historical landmark during the French Revolution in the 1790s. Here, you can see Marie Antoinette's prison cell, which was converted into a chapel in her memory. One can still follow the many traces of the French Revolution in this contemporary city. There's the Place de la Concorde and the Cour des Commerces, where the Marat, the extremist, published his newspaper L'Ami du Peuple. Seeped into the city's DNA is, of course, Paris's well-known heritage in arts and culture. Explore the cobblestone streets of Montmartre with its rich history of Belle Epoque artists and cabarets, or get a first-hand experience of the lifestyle in the neighborhood of Belleville. Get your culture fix at the Musée d'Orsay, at the newly renovated Picasso Museum, or course through the dozens of small museums and galleries you can visit in the city. Shopaholics will also delight in Paris's myriad options. From chic department stores that'll have all your fashion needs ready to famed boutiques for sheer designer items. Stroll along the Champs-Élysées or watch the fashion shows. If you're traveling during the Christmas season, be sure to check out the fancy window displays. There are also places to find the best fine jewelry. You'd also want to visit any of the famous neighborhood bakeries that sell perfect Parisian bread, made using traditional French techniques. Paris also has an impressive offering of food stops. The city boasts of 70 Michelin-starred restaurants. You'll find one for every specialty, from fresh premium oysters to award-winning edible works of art, like the famous pastries in Paris.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Yaroslav Trofimov, thank you so much for joining us. No Country for Love. This is your latest book, and a long line, quite frankly. You've had some prolific years. Walk me through how the idea for this book came to you.
Well, this is my first novel. So all the books I've written before were non-fiction books about Saudi Arabia, about Middle East, and about the war in Ukraine, this latest war that started in 2022. And I was living in Kabul when the conflict in Ukraine really began in 2014 with the first Russian invasion, when Crimea was taken, when really bloody conflict erupted in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. 14,000 people were killed at the time. And I remember reading about it and watching the news and being flabbergasted by just how misunderstood Ukraine was, how little knowledge there was of Ukraine's history, its past, and how everything that was known about it was known through this Russian colonial lens, because Russia was the colonial master for centuries, and all the experts and many of the journalists, having lived in Moscow, just saw Ukraine through the prism of Moscow.
As an extension.
As an extension of Russia, and explained its history through the Russian history. And I think the idea of this book for me was I was so upset about it, and I remembered my own family stories, the family stories of so many other Ukrainians, and decided to write a book that is explaining Ukraine, explaining the tragic history of Ukraine that really is, the reason why Ukrainians are so resilient in fighting against Russia today. And to do it through the history of my family, my grandmother, and the tribulations that she went through, in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, which is really a period when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth, because the combination of the famine, artificial famine, orchestrated by Moscow that killed millions and millions of people in the 1930s, the execution of the Ukrainian intellectual class, World War II, the Holocaust, and the insurgency after that war, really, wrought havoc across Ukraine and destroying its best minds and a large share of its people.
Yeah. What I found interesting about this narrative, I mean, so much of it is based, right, on the life of your grandmother.
Yes, absolutely. It's obviously it's a work of fiction, but many of the key turns in this narrative are really, based on true stories that I heard from my grandmother, from my family. And, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and, some of the actually most stunning turns of events in the book are from real life. Yeah. And it's informed by a lot of research as well. So I started writing this book in 2014, and I finished writing it just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022.
It's very interesting as well that your main character is a liberated woman, a new Soviet woman, if you will. And she sees the events of her life through that lens. She's not torn by religion in the same way that her parents were. She's not torn by social convention in the same way women in other democracies, for example, would have been torn. Yeah. She sees the events of her life as a liberated woman.
Right. Well, I mean, there was a lot of promise in the initial Soviet experiment. It was tragic, and it led to massive devastation and death. But there were some elements of it, like social liberation.
Which inevitably was rolled back.
Was rolled back as the regime became more and more conservative.
Yeah.
And so this book is also a story of dashed hopes, because it begins with the main character moving to Kharkiv, which then was the capital of Ukraine, to build a new life, to build the massive tractor plant, and to join the university, and find her husband. And then all of this gets crushed by this, sort of mid-grandeur of history, as one of the characters says it, because tragedy after tragedy befalls upon her. And at the end of the day, it's a book about survival against all odds, about survival in this, circumstances that are very hard to imagine for us even now, today, even at the time when there is a horrible war going on in Ukraine. But things were so much worse back then. And the cost of that survival, the betrayals, the compromises one has to make for one's own sake, for the sake of one's children, to actually live through all of this, and is it worth it at the end? That is sort of the biggest question of the book.
Yeah, and even against the backdrop of sort of not just the history of Russia, but the history of Ukraine in relation to Russia, which is, as you say, the meat grinder of history, so much hope and promise, and a consistent, sadly, narrative of that rolling back, whether it be through armed conflict or through governments or political machinations. In your mind, where is Ukraine on that journey today?
Well, it's a very good question, and it really links back to the past, because people are all very often puzzled. What is happening in Ukraine? Despite all this death and destruction, and hundreds of thousands of people are killed or maimed, fighting against overwhelming odds, the Ukrainians keep fighting and keep sacrificing and not giving up now for 2.5 years. And I think the explanation for that lies in this past. That's in the fact that everyone like me has a family that lived through all these dark years in the 30s, or the 40s, and the 50s, when just being Ukrainian was a crime. Speaking Ukrainian could be a crime. And there was a mass genocide during the artificial famine. And so and these are the sort of policies that are now being praised in Russia again. The first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the famine of the 1930s, because they say it never happened.
Revisionist history.
Exactly. It's so on the part of Ukraine, it's sort of never again, but on the part of Russia, it never happened. So it's a complete denial of the tragedies of the past, and I think that explains what the Ukrainians are fighting, because they know that the alternative to surrender would be so much more death,
yes,
and so much more destruction, the way it happened back in the past.
Yes. How does generational trauma play into not just the book, but also the Ukrainians' fight today?
Well, I think generational trauma is the explanation for the resilience of the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian military, because there is this knowledge back in the bones of everyone. Everyone has a grandmother, great-grandmother, who either was in the camps or who had family that died in a famine, terrible famine that had cannibalism and just things that are unthinkable now, or in the war, or in the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with inhuman means. Or the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with really brutal ways. And so people know that if they don't fight, if they don't keep up the resistance, the price they will pay will be much higher than what they're paying today.
Yeah. How difficult was it for you to write from a woman's perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Because you have some insight.
Yes, well, I had good readers and good advice, I guess. But I did a lot of research, and I did actually speak to my grandmother before she passed away at the age of 96. So, the older one gets, the more, I guess, the franker one gets about one's youth. Yes. So I did a lot of research in Ukraine before the war. Going to libraries, to archives. So I tried to really create the narrative in a way that is most reflective of reality. It's obviously not a nonfiction book, but I had to be really accurate with the historical record and with the historical descriptions of the way things used to be.
Yeah. You also, in the last couple of years, have written another nonfiction book. And of course, that's about your experiences on the front lines of Ukraine at the beginning of the Russian invasion. Our enemies will vanish. When you look at that book and the body of work that you did at that time and where we are today, what in your mind is the main difference? Is it the international backing for Ukraine in terms of weapons? Is it the fact that the entire world rallied around the Ukrainian cause? Perhaps not the global South, but certainly in the West?
Well, actually, so Our Enemies Will Vanish really focuses on the first year of the full-scale invasion, and not that much has actually changed since then. If you look at the map of the conflict, here and there the Russians gained, the Ukrainians gained a little bit in the Kursk region of Russia, but overall, the overall front line hasn't really changed. So there's been a war of attrition going on since then. I think what has changed is the erosion of the Russian red lines. So things that were unthinkable back then, such as long-range Ukrainian strikes, all over Russia, hitting military airfields, oil refineries, Ukraine actually invading sovereign Russian territory. All of these all of these actions were thought of as, triggering nuclear war, completely unrealistic. And yet Ukraine showed that this can be done. And I think Ukraine is successfully, since then, redrawing the parameters of the conflict. It's not able to advance in the battlefield necessarily, but it's expanding the war into Russia, and it's creating costs for Russia that it has to reckon with.
Yeah, and that there's also, of course, been the cost for Ukraine and not just lives lost. In your mind, how close are we to an end to this conflict today?
It's hard to predict, but it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, really. Russian government and President Putin and other senior members of the government have not given up on the initial aim of the invasion, which is to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country. And they still talk about Odessa and Kharkiv and Kyiv as being Russian cities. And nothing indicates that they are ready to accept Ukraine as an independent state. Yeah. And the Ukrainians, while suffering from the consequences of war, economic consequences, millions of people had to leave the country, hundreds of thousands were killed or maimed. However, they're not ready to sacrifice the land that is Ukrainian, and they're not ready to give up just yet. So I think we're in for months, years, possibly, of continuing warfare.
In your mind, does the U.S. presidential election have anything to do with that timeline? Because, of course, former U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled, he'd end the war the day he got in office, or at least try to.
Well, I think, peace comes from a decision by one or both parties that they cannot achieve their objectives through war. And that requires one of the parties to be defeated, or at least to feel like they have more to lose from continuing than from stopping. And we're not at that stage yet. President Trump, former President Trump, has said he will bring peace to Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't said how. I'm sure Ukrainians would love to have peace in 24 hours. The question is at what cost?
Yeah, and politically, you don't see President Zelensky having any wiggle room when it comes to an agreement that would see him give up territory.
Possibly. I mean, it depends on how the conflict continues and depends on what level of casualties the Ukrainians sustain. But, he created new chips on the table. By occupying part of Russia, there is now part of Russia that can trade for Ukrainian territory. By having these long-range strikes into Russian territory, he can now trade that for Russia stopping attacking Ukraine with its missiles and long-range drones. Sorry.
I'll let you choke. Talk to me about the cabinet shakeup. President Zelensky, several months ago, changed up his defense minister, and then just recently his foreign minister as well. And his foreign minister was a gentleman, Dmitry Kuleba, who was well loved by many Western democratic leaders. Was this wise, in your mind, to change horses midstream?
Well, it's not the first shakeup that the Ukrainian government has since the war began. We've had the defense minister removed, we've had General Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, removed, and sent to London.
Controversially.
Right, and sent to London to be ambassador of Ukraine to the United Kingdom. So the power really rests within Bankova, the headquarters of President Zelensky's administration. That's really where all the decisions are made right now. And he removed the foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba. He appointed to replace him Andriy Sybiha, who was the main foreign policy advisor to the presidency, former Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey and Poland. And then in another sort of important shakeup, the Minister of Strategic Industries, which means the Minister of the Military Industries, commission was moved to the presidency to be the president's advisor for strategic industries, which is actually a raise, a promotion. So at the end of the day, the only two people who make sort of all the main calls are Zelensky and his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak.
Who is a controversial figure.
Well, everyone is a controversial figure.
In your mind, especially with this, the promotion of is it now the ministry? He's now an advisor to the president. That, of course, is interesting from a business perspective because there were comments very early on by those in business in Ukraine. They were worried about being nationalized industries from energy to what is now military production. In your mind, are those fears valid?
Well, I can speak to military production. I think what's happening is that there was a decision to really expand that sphere, which is critical for Ukraine's survival, especially in things like drone production, to the private sector. So there are hundreds of individual producers that are all competing for this projects and are being paid by the government, partially with Western assistance. And we have seen the results in the drone industry of Ukraine really taking a leap and developing technologies that allow it to strike very long distances, more than 1,000 miles away in Russia, and really dominating the battlefield with drones in a way that Russia cannot, even though Russia has a much bigger industrial base.
And today, the drone warfare between Russia and Ukraine is the most deadly.
Well, it's certainly critical, because everything is now determined by drones. FPV drones that cost a couple $100 can now kill tanks, and that cost millions of dollars. And they're being used every day.
In your mind, when it comes to the situation today in Ukraine, is it more or less corrupt than before the invasion?
Well, it's hard to say. War obviously corrupts. Every war creates opportunities for corruption. We've seen it in every war in human history. Just read Catch-22. What Ukraine also has is a very robust independent media, and so it does expose instances of corruption. The scandal of the defense ministry, where the result of which the minister had to leave and some of his deputies ended up in jail, was because of exposure by the Ukrainian media about kickbacks in the procurement of actually eggs for the military. And you have scandals breaking out all the time, and action is being taken when it's public. So I think this is the strength of Ukraine when compared to Russia, where I'm sure there is just as much more corruption, but because it's swept under the rug, very often you see the results of it in the underperformance of the Russian military.
Yeah, we've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE both instrumental in conversations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, working with the United States. Yeah. How interesting is that to you? Because you and I have both covered the Gulf countries for a long time now. I think that seeing that foreign policy influence in quite this way is really a new move for the Gulf.
Yeah, well, it's a trio, really. It's Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey. And I think they all three work in coordination on key issues, obviously the prisoner exchanges, but also exchanges of this recent hostage swap deal, in which my colleague Evan Gershkovich was released in Turkey, was also partially negotiated with the help of Saudi Arabia. And actually President Putin publicly thanked Saudi Arabia for its help in this. And so these three countries have this unique position of being aligned with the U.S., but also having full relations with Russia. They have not imposed any sanctions. There are flights every day from Dubai or from Istanbul to Moscow. And so they have these lines of communication and are trusted by both sides.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because a few years ago, I would have suggested that Saudi Arabia or the UAE be the conduit for conversations, for example, with China, between the U.S. and China. And privately, I got a lot of pushback from U.S. officials who were not interested in allowing that to happen. But this invasion really sort of upset the table, in a sense, and brought the Gulf Arab countries very much into the fore of international relations in a way that they weren't before.
Right. But also, the U.S. has a direct line to China. I mean, the U.S. and Chinese officials meet and talk. That's not the case on the higher levels between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah. So they need all the help they can get.
Exactly. And, it's an issue of trust. There has to be a place for this exchange, for example, that both sides trust. Turkey or Saudi Arabia, UAE are one of these places.
You're also the author of a book, The Siege of Mecca. Obviously, you covered what's been a drastic change for the kingdom in the last several years with King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, his son, the crown prince. In your mind, does Saudi Arabia today have an issue when it comes to how quickly they've modernized, how quickly they've become, frankly, a new country under MBS's reforms?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the one answer to this is that we haven't really seen any pushback that is concerning. There hasn't been violence, there hasn't been protests. So the society seems to be accepting all this, also because society has changed.
Yes.
With such a huge share of the population being young and much more open to these new ideas, to
and
these
having
changes.
access to phones, which has
Exactly.
changed everything.
Yes, exactly. So, Saudi Arabia of today is a very different country from Saudi Arabia of even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And, I think the history of the book of the Siege of Mecca and the actual Siege of Mecca was that in 1979, as a prize for supporting the government retaking the Grand Mosque of Mecca, which was taken by a bunch of radicals from all over the world, the government of Saudi Arabia at the time agreed to reverse sort of the slow liberalization of the country and to give the religious establishment control over much of the society. So that has ended under Mohammed bin Salman. The religious police was disbanded, and this, frankly, the country's on social level, in terms of personal freedoms, especially for women, is so much more open than it was a few years ago.
Yeah. So they have learned the lessons, in your mind, of what it means to frankly, hand over your power to religious autocracy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But also, times have changed all over the world.
Yeah. Talk to me about Afghanistan, because obviously you had a front row seat for not only the war in Afghanistan, but also, of course, the evacuation of the U.S. and the U.K. and other NATO members as they decided to leave that country. Yeah. Disaster to disaster. Where are we today?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, right? I mean, on one hand, yes, the Taliban regime is terrible. The restrictions of women are harrowing. Girls cannot go to school. Women have a hard time having permission to work. But if you were to ask ordinary Afghans, especially in villages, not in the cities, many would tell you that this is all terrible, but there is no war.
Yeah.
Nobody's dying. And this is a new thing for Afghanistan. For 40 years,
yes,
there was constant war.
Yes.
And so and that explains why there is no resistance to the Taliban today, because no matter how difficult the restrictions are, the fact that people do not have to bury their children every day, the fact that there's no bombings, no raids, they can travel the country, go to markets, visit each other, I think still outweighs any appeal that the resistance might have against the Taliban for now.
In your mind, what is the responsibility of the West to these women that we told you can live a modern, full life?
I think it's
we've
huge.
Abandoned.
I think it's huge. I mean, there were many promises made to the people of Afghanistan over the course of decades, actually, 20 years of Western presence there. And then one day the US just picked up and left, with people trying to cling on to the wheels of the planes taking off in Kabul airport. I was there watching it.
Yes. Is this a stain on the Biden presidency?
I think it's a stain not just on the Biden presidency. I think it's a stain on the collective record of the West and the US, and on the credibility that the US has with potential allies. And I would say more. I think this is one of the reasons that inspired President Putin to invade Ukraine, because watching the disaster in Kabul in the summer of 2021, he could not help himself but conclude that we have nothing to fear from the West. And also, it's one of the reasons why the US and others refused to give weapons to Ukraine before the war, because the images of the Taliban driving Humvees and MRAPs and even flying Blackhawks were enough to convince the US and allies that, if we give weapons to the Ukrainians, we'll see the same once the Russians take over Kiev. So it was a double blow to the Ukrainians.
Yaroslav, it's great to have you. No Country for Love, new book, everybody buy it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
If you ever have the opportunity to hold a manuscript, it will captivate you and take you to other worlds. As soon as your eyes fall upon its front page, you will stand amazed as you behold the style and method of writing present on it. Everything here is subject to rules, and writing does not stray far from this. Even the title and the basmala adhere to these rules, as well as the introduction, sections, chapters, and finally reaching the conclusion. The rigor of the curriculum is certain, as is good writing. The manuscript is divided according to its physical components, which are paper, midad, scripts, and binding. The content of the manuscript is another story. The research method is the basis of this content. After reviewing thousands of manuscripts and studying them attentively and carefully, it was found that most of them follow a similar methodological approach. The approach includes research methodology, classification, and authorship. It is a methodology that has been prevalent since the early beginnings of writing and is still present today. After the allure of the manuscript's exterior wears off, you open the cover, and your eyes will fall upon the first page, and you'll notice that it's most likely a piece of white paper. From here, you realize the first rule in the essentials of writing among the Arabs in the early Islamic era, which is to leave the first page of the manuscript blank. Nothing is written on this page, for fear of it being tampered with or contaminated due to frequent use, or perhaps some of the lines of writing become blurry. It was also placed for binding purposes, or to have plant-like decorations on it, or drawings. It is rare for manuscripts to have a specific page designated for the title. Many manuscripts have had the title page left blank. The copyists would add the title of the book and the author's name to it later on. The owner or the reader of the book may also do so. This explains the difference between the scripts and fonts that are found in the title and the manuscript itself. It is possible to make a mistake when placing the title of the book, or when attributing the book to an author. It is possible to sometimes find a preface or a prologue on the title page, or the ownership deed that includes the legal purchase details as well as the price paid for the manuscript by the buyer. On this page, you can also find the names of the witnesses who were mentioned, and many other things that have nothing to do with the author or the copyist. The introduction to the manuscript would not be without the basmala. Unless the first page or several pages of the manuscripts were missing. Some manuscripts that were written by non-Muslims would begin with the basmala, abiding by and honoring the Quran, and following the Quran's style and approach. They also praise the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, his people and followers, until the Day of Judgment, along with some prayers. When you browse through the pages of the manuscript, you will notice many writings that are found in the margins. These writings are called footnotes. After the scholars read a certain manuscript, they would write many footnotes as observations or comments. Even some of them, if collected and organized, could become a standalone book in their own right. After the doxology, the author would state, "And now." Then they would mention their name, the topic they desire to research, and the reasons that prompted them to do so. The scholar should mention their methodology and divide the manuscript into sections and chapters, among other matters that the author deems necessary. In the introduction, there is a lot of important information, such as the title of the manuscript, for example. The scholar may mention the title of another one of their works, which leads us to further know the author, if they were not already mentioned on the title page or in the introduction. The scientist may explain the subject they are researching and define its parameters. They would cite sources and references that they derived the material of their book from. The author would mention the name of their sheikhs and teachers, who they were taught by, or whose material that they had read. In the introduction, they would sometimes list the name of some of their students. When reading the introduction, we can discern what the copyist added to the manuscript. We can also find evidence or references to the date of when the manuscript was composed or classified. A summary of the material that the manuscript elaborates upon can be sometimes found. The manuscript's conclusion is no less important than its introduction or its content. It includes the information that it contained that was not found anywhere else in the manuscript, such as the title of the manuscript or the author's name, regardless of whether the author themselves mentioned it or the copyist did so. Some manuscripts may contain a phrase that indicates the completion of the text, such as, "The book is completed." In addition to the date of its completion and the sources on which the author relied on while categorizing their book. A historical event is mentioned in the conclusion, in which the copyist or author dates this copy of the manuscript. They can also include the title of another book by the author. The copyist has a way of writing the final sentences of the manuscript. They would usually be written as an upside-down triangle, with its base directed towards the top, and the top of the triangle would be at the bottom, and it was referred to as al-harda. Manuscripts have persevered and traversed through time to our current days. They were preserved and transmitted developments in the ways of writing and authorship among the Arabs. The content of their books form threads of light that still shine and glimmer to this day.
We go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, President Putin ramps up nuclear threats once again, this after President Biden greenlights Ukraine's use of long-range US missiles in Russia. After a boost of support from the US, President Zelensky addresses a special session of the EU Parliament on this, the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump, the migrant crisis at the US-Mexico border can now be considered as a national emergency, one which he says will require military intervention. And close to 100 aid trucks have been looted in Gaza, meaning further food insecurity for the people of the Palestinian enclave. Welcome to the program. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, does not seem to be letting President Biden's approval of Ukraine's use of US long-range missiles go unanswered. In response, he has approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, now stating that an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, will be treated as a joint assault on Russia. Well, the updated doctrine, proposed last September, was ratified today on what was the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Well, Washington has been accused by Russia of escalating the war in Ukraine, or as the Kremlin puts it, adding fuel to the fire. Well, all this comes after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use US-made missiles, allowing it to strike deep into Russian territory for the first time. Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak now to Philip Breedlove, who is a retired four-star general who served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again, General Breedlove. Great to have you with us. I'd like to put to you this new development that we're following here at Al Arabiya. Russia says that Ukraine has fired these US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory. And this, of course, just the day after President Zelensky was given permission by the Biden administration to do so. What are your thoughts at this stage?
Well, I am thankful that our government has changed its policy. This is a change we should have made years ago. Russia has been firing into Ukraine from the Belarus airspace, Russian airspace, Black Sea airspace. They have been using missiles from at least 2 other countries and missile parts from China to develop their own missiles to fire into Ukraine. And so we in the West have, in that same time, forbidden Ukraine from using any of our equipment to return fire. It was an absurd policy when it was first made, and hopefully now we are past that point.
I mean, if this is confirmed, do you find it surprising that the Ukrainians were so quick to use this new weaponry?
No, I mean, there have been targets that were appropriate for this kind of missile for months and years. This is a capability that we should have given Ukraine a long time ago. And so they've had a developed target list, and it does not surprise me that they would fire quickly. Remember that in the last 3 or 4 days, Ukraine has come under intense attack by Russia. Russia has increased its ferocity in this attack. Some say it's sort of an answer to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump told them not to accelerate the war, and Mr. Putin has chosen to accelerate the war since he's been told not to. And so as Russia does accelerate this war, just the other night they fired over 210 long-range weapons into Ukraine. Since they have stepped it up, then Mr. Zelensky has replied.
Okay, so of course Ukraine has now confirmed that it's used these ATACMS, and we've heard Russia reacting to this, saying this signals a new phase of, quote, Western war. I'm just wondering what you see as being possible next steps by Russia.
Well, Russia is throwing everything they have at Ukraine right now. I'm not sure that there is more left for them to accelerate with. Of course, the Western world is fearful they might use a nuclear weapon. This is what Mr. Putin wants the West to believe. His army has failed him in many ways. His air force has failed him in many ways. His Black Sea fleet has been defeated in the northern Black Sea. What works extremely well for Mr. Putin is his war of intimidation. He continues to threaten the West on almost a daily basis about things that the West told him they were fearful of. Nuclear exchange and or a widening of the war. And these are the things that Mr. Putin talks about all the time. What has he done in the last 2 days? He says he signed a new document which changes their nuclear doctrine. This is the way Mr. Putin replies to challenges from the West. He steps up his rhetoric, he steps up his intimidation, and he expects the West to back down.
You don't sound very concerned. I mean, the European top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has said that Russia is irresponsible for using this kind of rhetoric. But how can we be so sure it's just that? It's only rhetoric. How can we be sure that Russia...
I don't think I've said this morning that it's just rhetoric. I just said this is what he uses. We have to be academically honest that he might use some of these weapons. I mean, in our past... we faced similar, if not worse, crises in America, and our President Kennedy stood up to it, and he solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in the intermediate nuclear range missile crisis, Mr. Reagan stood up to it, and he solved that crisis. And so we now are in a similar situation to those two. And academically, they both faced real reactions by Russia. And we do face real reactions by Russia. But what we do know for sure is that every time Mr. Putin threatens us, we back up, then we know exactly what the results are. We will be backing up. At some point, the West has to take a look at this threat and take a different action, I think. Just one more point. In 2008, the reply of the West to the invasion and occupation of Georgia was inadequate. We gave great gift to Russia in that they kept 20% of Georgia. We rewarded bad behavior. Then in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. The West's reply was once again inadequate to task. And we rewarded Russian behavior by allowing them to keep portions of Ukraine. And now in 2024, we are faced with a similar situation. Will we once again reward bad behavior, or will we make a change in Western policy?
Well, that remains to be seen, doesn't it, with the new administration coming to power in 2 months from now in D.C. I mean, what do you see the Trump administration bringing to the table with regards to relations with Moscow and with regard specifically to this conflict with Ukraine?
Well, I think that we clearly will have some, as the naval officers say, a sea change in the way this is approached. Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, former President Trump, has said that he wants to end this war quickly, and I believe it. I think he wants to find an end to this war quickly. I think that at this point, as you've seen many pundits writing, Mr. Putin sees that and sees that he thinks he has the upper hand because he believes Mr. Trump needs a quick end. And so this is going to end up in an interesting negotiation. Mr. Trump has already told Mr. Putin not to accelerate this war. Mr. Putin has chosen to accelerate the war in answer to Mr. Trump's demands. And so I think the conversation has already started.
I just want to pick up on something you were saying a moment ago, recalling the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Of course, that's the closest, isn't it, that the world has come that we know of to proper, full-blown international nuclear warfare. Do you think this is the next most dangerous point that we've come to in history, to full-blown nuclear war?
I'm not sure I would categorize it as that. Again, we had the intermediate range nuclear missile crisis of the Cold War that President Reagan handled. I think that what I would say is that if the West always backs up, we will get closer and closer to nuclear war. A famous Russian thinker once tells a story of, as you approach your enemy, fix your bayonet and press your bayonet into the enemy's belly. And if it is soft, push further and harder. If the belly is hard, step back and reconsider your options. And so right now, in 08, in 14, our belly was soft, and Mr. Putin is pushing further and harder. We have a choice to make in 2024.
Today is, of course, the 1,000th day of this war in Ukraine. Winter is approaching, and I expect you, like lots of military experts, have been following the conflict very closely these last 3 years. What typically happens at this time of year, or perhaps what typically doesn't happen at this time of year? Perhaps I should rephrase the question, because isn't it a time when people's positions get sort of entrenched, the ground turns extremely hard? Can we expect much to happen on the ground in the next couple of months?
Well, I'm not being rude, but let me correct you. This war is 10 years old. It started in the early winter of 2014 when I was the commander of NATO. And it has been going for 10 years. It's been hot for the first couple of years. Then it went warm as the line in the Donbass settled for some number of years. And now we're almost 1,000 days into the latest part of this 10-year-long war. So to To the second part of your question, repeat it, please.
I was just wondering what typically happens at this time of year, given that the ground is so
I'm sorry.
hard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So lots of things happen due to the weather. We go through a really muddy period where the ground is untrafficable for large armored formations. Then we get to a frozen hard period where armored vehicles can once again move, but it's really hard to move an army around when it's so cold. And so then in the spring, we'll go back through another intensely muddy period where there's no trafficability for for heavy weapons for a while. So the tactics of the battlefield seem to settle down. And what happens typically for Russia is they intensify their attack against the Ukrainian people. As you watch how Russia has bombed Ukraine over the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 1,000 days, Russia's attack is almost uniquely towards the Russian or to the Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, all the things that get Ukraine through a cold winter. This is what Russia is attacking. They've proved rather unable to put an intense attack against the Ukrainian forces, so they focus on the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian civil infrastructure.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again. General Philip Breedlove, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get some more analysis now. We can speak to the former spokesperson for the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Sergei Markov, who joins us now from Moscow. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Markov. Washington, of course, gave Ukraine the green light to use those long-range army tactical missile systems weapons, also known as ATACMS, against targets in Russia. And we understand they have now been used in Bryansk. I'm just wondering what more you can tell us about the situation.
I think you explained situation by wrong way. You just repeated those propagandistic lie which expressed by Washington. Situation absolutely another. And Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, stressed this very clearly. The point is that it's not allowing for Washington to Ukrainian army to use these rocket missiles. But it's direct using of such rocket missiles against Russia by American army, because Ukrainian army not able to use ATACMS, these ballistic missiles on the long distance to Russia, because Ukrainian army has no technical opportunity such as satellite intelligence group, which needed for using such missiles. Another kind of missiles is Storm Shadow and Scalp, French Scalp and British Storm Shadow. This is cruise missiles. They also cannot be used by Ukrainian army without America, because it's need, first of all, same satellite group, but also it's needed a very good digital map of Russian territory for such cruise missile. It's even Great Britain and France has not such kind of map, but only Russia and United States. So if these missiles will be used against Russia, it means that American army directly took to the war against Russia. It's not Ukrainian. It's American strike against Russian cities and in other places. It's the point. It's this rocket missile didn't change situation dramatically on the front line, because these missiles have been used already against Crimea, against Donbass, and another new territory of Russia, internationally not recognized.
So if they have been used, Mr. Markov, if they have been used, how's Russia going to respond? How's Russia going to respond if they have been used?
Nobody knows.
Russia must know.
Decide. Russia will wait some moment. Probably Russia will give a strong military response. It means Russia now has the right to attack all American military goals. American military base in Poland, in Germany, in Romania, and in other European countries. Also, Russia can attack the American satellites group, which used for such kind of attack, American aviation, military aviation, and so on. Okay. And its military response. Probably first Russia will try to give some political response, taking account that this is crime of Joe Biden group. Joe Biden is some kind of regarded in Moscow as a maniac who personally hate Vladimir Putin, because in 2011, Biden strongly recommended Putin not to go to the next presidential term, and Vladimir Putin strongly said no to him.
Let me put this question to you. Let me put this question to you, Mr. Markov. Is the West now in direct conflict with Russia?
Can you repeat? Sorry.
Is the West now in direct conflict with Russia?
Not yet, because we didn't see this big strike yet. There are some rumors that probably in Bryansk region had been used or not used. Now we see indirect, through media, information about that Biden made the decision to come to the direct war against Russia. But we didn't see the real fact about it. When Vladimir Putin sees the real fact, he will react. Frankly speaking, if it will be not strike against Washington and London, it's first of all because goodwill of Vladimir Putin.
Just want to pick up on something you said to the British media. You said that people in the UK could be spending Christmas in bomb shelters. Could you just clarify for us what you meant by that?
Yeah. It's very easily. Of course, Vladimir Putin don't want to give a strong military response and to come to the big global war. Of course, Vladimir Putin don't want to have nuclear war. But you understand, if United States and Great Britain started direct attacking of their militaries against Russia, Russia has to respond. And if it will be exchange of rocket missiles, first of all, non-nuclear, but then it could be moved, because it's nuclear powers, it could be moved to the nuclear, using of nuclear weaponry, and possibly already this year, big nuclear catastrophe could happen. And already mentioned that probably it will happen before Christmas holidays. And probably instead of saying Merry Christmas to all families, British and American people, and we will have to sit down in the holes in the S, trying to hide away from the radioactive clouds.
Okay, well, that's something to think about. And, of course, Mr. Putin has lowered the threshold for a nuclear strike. And it's my last question to you. I mean, just listening to what you were saying and listening to the rhetoric from Moscow the last 24 hours, there are people in the West who say every time the West steps up its support for Ukraine, Russia threatens nuclear war. And, of course, we're 1,000 days into this conflict. So far, that hasn't happened. So what is your message to people who say that Russia is simply bluffing?
Russia don't want to use nuclear weaponry, but Russia wants to stress that if three nuclear powers like United States, Great Britain, and France come to the war against another nuclear power, Russia, this nuclear war could happen even by natural development of the events. Look how World War I started. Nobody wanted such a big catastrophe as appeared to be this great war as World War I. But it happened because events move politicians. Events command politicians, but not politicians command events. It's a situation with Russia afraid very much. And Russia, and I am asking you, British people, don't attack Russia. Don't send your rocket missiles to Russian cities. As a way, you will have the response of Russian rocket missiles to your cities. Take this in your mind.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sergei Markov, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, as the US gives Ukraine the green light to use American-supplied long-range missiles in Russia, the world now looks to the United Kingdom to see if they're going to follow suit. Well, joining us now from London is Sean Bell, a military expert and former RAF fighter pilot. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Arabiya News. We've received this confirmation now that Ukraine has indeed fired these US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory. I'd just like to ask for your thoughts.
Well, it's in a way, it feels as a military guy, a story about nothing. Part of the reason for that is that, Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine has been seeking help from the West. The West has been providing weapons. But for some reason, the West decided to, rather than just say, use these weapons in accordance with the law of armed conflict, off you go, it puts some restrictions on them. And of course, that means as soon as those restrictions get lifted, then all of a sudden it gives an opportunity for President Putin to wail again. That Russia has been targeting Ukraine across the whole country, energy infrastructure, headquarters, ammunition dumps, railway yards, airfields. It does seem a bit bizarre that Ukraine is not allowed to do exactly the same thing to Russia. And the fact that Russia will wail about it, it's been wailing every step of the way when the West has been involved. I don't think we're seeing anything particularly new yet. I think what's also interesting is whether or not the UK will follow suit, and the French with the Scalp and obviously the Storm Shadow missile. But to be brutally honest, these weapons, although it's symbolic, there aren't many of these ATACMS around. They're very expensive. Storm Shadow has limited supply. Actually, this won't be a turning point of the war. Even President Zelensky admitted that. But it has created a bit of a furore in the media and, of course, for President Putin.
Okay, of course, Ukraine hasn't wasted any time using these new weapons. I mean, so what you're basically saying is that ATACMS and that category of weapon is not likely to be a game changer, and there's nothing particularly significant about them as weapons. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is ATACMS is a very spectacular weapon. I mean, it's supersonic, it goes ballistic, it goes 200 miles, it's precision strike. It's very, very effective. The downside is that they're over $1 million a shot. The warhead is only 500 pounds, so it can't do a significant amount of damage. And because they are so expensive, there's very limited supplies of them. It's not as if Ukraine is going to have vast quantities of these to be able to throw around at targets in Ukraine. The other challenge, of course, is that unlike conventional sort of anti-tank weapons, bullets and stuff like that, you can give them to the soldiers on the ground, they just fire them. When you're firing a target 200 miles away, you don't know where the target is. You need a whole load of intelligence, satellite imagery, to try and work out, is it worth firing this very expensive round? It's going to take several minutes to get there, all of which is valuable for a certain target set. But actually, it's going to be very limited numbers of these weapons actually available, and they take a lot of complex planning. The one benefit, of course, is that we understand President Putin's already moved most of his fighter jets outside 200 miles radius of Ukraine, therefore keep them out of reach. Why is that value to Ukraine? Well, it means it's a lot more complicated for those air missions to get all the way to Ukraine, do their job and get back again with the limited fuel they have available. So it is having an effect, but it won't be the seismic change that I think some in the media are portraying it.
And of course, we've heard Moscow saying that the threshold for a nuclear strike has now been lowered. I mean, do you think, as many people who've spoken to us on this channel have said, that this is just rhetoric? Or do you think that perhaps this time Mr. Putin might be serious about carrying out a nuclear strike?
Problem is, Tom, I've got grey hair here. I've been around the block a few times. When I joined the military, we're in the Cold War. We were expecting nuclear Armageddon. We were planning one-way sorties. For the last 30 years, that's not been on the table at all, and I think people have got a bit desensitized to it all. And whilst the nuclear weapons are abhorrent, their very existence is abhorrent, but they are with us. But there's mutually assured destruction. If either side was to use them, it wipes them out completely. I have no doubt Putin has no intention whatsoever of using nuclear weapons. That would lead to Armageddon. That's to nobody's benefit. What he is doing very successfully successfully and has done throughout this war is try to scare the West, because the West, we talk about the West as being a unified body of countries. It's only actually as strong as the weakest link, and many people get nervous. Understandably so, when we talk about nuclear weapons. And therefore, Putin has found that that rhetoric is incredibly effective at stultifying, limiting what the West is prepared to do. I have little doubt that at the moment, if you listen to the words and look at in detail what he said, he's actually not changed anything. We're no closer to nuclear Armageddon, but my goodness, has it rattled cages and caused the world's media to focus. That has having exactly the effect that President Putin was trying to achieve with this rhetoric.
Yeah, but not only him. We've also heard Donald Trump Jr., for example, saying that the outgoing Biden administration is trying to lead the United States into World War III, or words to that effect. And there are also those analysts who are saying we're now entering the most dangerous phase of what's been a 1,000-day conflict, if you count the start of the Russian invasion as being the start of this conflict. Why do you think people are calling it the most dangerous phase? Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think you've got to split out the US politic angle here. We could spend hours talking about that, couldn't we? I don't think that necessarily has got to do with the military effectiveness. That is a bit of the new boy coming in town. The king is dead, long live the king. There's been even talk that Biden's only done this to make life more difficult for Trump. I don't buy that at all. I think there's a very clear reason. Ukraine is embattled at the moment. It might be that as we approach the 20th of January, that actually there might be a window of opportunity for a negotiation. If that negotiation is to bear fruit, Russia will not want to have any Ukraine forces on Russian territory. At the moment in the Kursk region, there are quite a number. Russia is throwing 50,000 troops and a load of North Korean troops and trying to get rid of the Ukrainians out of that area. And that's why I believe Biden has given the green light, not to go and strike targets all over Russia, but to try and help Ukraine maintain their foothold there, because that will give them a stronger negotiating position come the day if there is a negotiation.
And on this 1,000th day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what's your assessment of what the situation is like on the ground as we head into the winter months?
Well, I was there, Tom, only a few weeks ago. I went for a week, and whilst I can't claim to have a hit test of the whole country, and I didn't go anywhere near the front line, I'm way too past my best sell-by date for that. But I sensed a very different mood in the country from many, many months, indeed years of absolute, we're going to beat the Russians, it's just a matter of time. There was this sense of weariness, the sense that the prospect of victory, whatever that meant, but in Ukrainians' eyes of kicking Russia out of every corner of Ukraine, was that really, was that prospect fading out of view? And therefore, how would this war end? And I sense there was a much different tone about the conflict. And the danger, of course, is that Ukraine is on the back foot. They are struggling. They've had the best that the West has available to offer. It looks likely under the Trump administration there might be less available. And therefore, for Ukraine, the prospects are looking quite bleak. And therefore, is it the right time to stop Russia suddenly doing a breakthrough and potentially take a lot more of Ukraine? Or is the chance to actually sit down and try to maybe cede territory? It's a horrible conversation, Tom. I mean, it's no win either way, but the loss of life has been significant. You only have to go to Maidan Square in the middle of the capital, Kyiv, and see the tens of thousands of flags fluttering. It's a poignant reminder of the growing toll of this war. And there might be that actually Ukrainians are starting to look at, is there another way for this war to end that might mean that we cede territory, but by contrast, that secures their sovereignty of what remains into the future and secure funding for rebuilding their country?
Yeah, and when we hear President Zelensky speaking today on the anniversary of the 1,000 days of warfare in his country, he says that the year 2025 is going to be a decisive one in determining who wins the war. And I'm just wondering why you think he thinks that is the case. I mean, is that, do you think, principally because of politics in the United States?
I think there's a lot of that because, let's face it, although Europe and the US give a roughly equal amount of money, in terms of military equipment, it's the US that by far and away predominates that. And therefore, there's no doubt Zelensky will be concerned. I think we've got to be careful about some of the rhetoric. We've both been following this for some time. It was only springtime last year when President Zelensky was announcing his spring offensive. You know, he said a few months earlier, give me the weapons and I'll sweep Russia out. Well, last year, we didn't really see much movement in the front line. And this year, it's all been Ukraine on the back foot. Zelensky's prepared a victory plan that hasn't really docked very well at all. And bluntly, the only way that really Ukraine is going to sweep Russia out is if the West was actually to get directly involved, put a no-fly zone in place, potentially put combatants on the ground, and Russia wouldn't have an answer to that. But as we stand at the moment, there's no appetite for Western politicians to get directly involved, and therefore the prospects for a victory, whatever that means for Ukraine, don't look very likely. But therefore, what does good look like, given where we stand today? I think that's where probably President Zelensky start to focus a bit more today.
Indeed, and he also said that he wants Europe in particular to push Russia harder, he said. And I'm just wondering whether you think with this change of administration about to happen in 2 months from now in Washington, whether you can see the EU and the UK perhaps using their influence. And let's not forget, even the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has said that support for Ukraine was ironclad only today. Similar language being used by European leaders. Do you think those EU leaders and the UK leadership can somehow pressure or influence the incoming Trump administration and somehow try to get Trump to be more supportive of Ukraine than he suggested that he might be?
I've no doubt they'll try and have an influence. I mean, I think one of the unknowns here is that President-elect Trump has been very good at the rhetoric. What actually gets delivered is often another matter. You'll recall when he first came to power, he said, I'm going to build a wall with Mexico. Didn't finish that. I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. He certainly didn't deliver that. And he said, I'm going to deal with that little man from North Korea. And he didn't do that either. What it did, though, it gave a clear idea of where his intent was. And his intent at the moment is clearly America first. It's clearly that NATO, if it is to exist, everybody needs to pay their way. And that's a wake-up call for Europe. And he's also turned around and said, look, I'm going to be focused on China. You Europeans, you probably need to focus on Russia. Now step up to the plate and start to react. And unfortunately, that is very difficult for some European countries to do because there's a big yawning gap between if America was to reduce its level of support, it's going to be a very difficult gap for the Europeans to fill. So I do think there's some interesting conversations to happen. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. President Trump, from this side of the pond, it looks a bit alarming. But I have to say, on a positive side, I suspect he might be a bit of a breath of fresh air because he's going to be combative. He's going to meet force with force. He's going to intimidate. And that might be just the way to deal with some of these autocrats that are around the world.
OK, well, it's been really great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time. Sean Bell, thank you so much.
Cheers, Tom.
1,000 days and counting since Russia began its long drawn-out military action in Ukraine. But according to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, at least 11,743 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. Nearly 25,000 others have been injured. At least 589 of the victims are thought to have been children. Well, even as the fighting shows no signs of slowing down, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky vowed that his country will never submit.
While some European leaders think about, some elections or something like this at Ukraine's expense, Putin is focused on winning this war. He will not stop on his own. The more time he has, the worse the conditions become. Every today is the best moment to push Russia harder, and it's clear without certain key factors, Russia will lack real motivation to engage in meaningful negotiations.
Well, President Zelensky, speaking to the European Parliament, noted that 2025 will have, quote, decisive moments on who will prevail in this fight.
We need resilience of entire Ukraine at decisive moments which will come next year. We should prevent anyone in the world from doubting the resilience of our country. At this stage of the war, it is being decided who will prevail, whether us over the enemy or the enemy over us Ukrainian and Europeans.
President Zelensky speaking there. Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak to Alexei Goncharenko, who is a Ukrainian politician, member of the Ukrainian parliament, who joins us now from Kyiv. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Some news just coming into us. Washington has, of course, given Ukraine this green light to use long-range army tactical missile systems weapons, which are also known as ATACMS, against military targets in Russia. And according to reports, Ukraine has used them already now in the region of Bryansk in Russia. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, we have these reports that a big depot of Russian artillery shells and missiles was destroyed this night. And this is announced by Russian Ministry of Defense, that it was done with ATACMS, American ATACMS. So if to believe them, and I don't know for what reason they could have to lie in these occasions. They often lie, but this time I don't know for what they can do this. It was done by ATACMS. And that's great. That means that these weapons works in the hands of Ukrainian military.
Russia saying that the use of ATACMS by Ukraine would signal a new phase of Western war. What do you think Russia means by this?
I don't know. It's bluffing once again. Russia said, oh, if something like this would happen, that would mean some Armageddon. And what? Just minutes ago, Lavrov commented it in Lavrov, his Russian foreign minister. He commented it in Rio de Janeiro at G20 meeting. He said, we are very strongly against any possibility of nuclear war. And it was very funny. He said that we are not still finally sure that it was American missiles. So Russian Ministry of Defense said it is American missiles. Russian Foreign Ministry is not sure is it American missiles. So I can tell you there will be no significant reaction or some specific escalation from Russia. Everything they can do against Ukraine, they are already doing. And they don't have capacity to attack any other country because they are not so strong like they try to show. They can't win over Ukraine, which is in several times smaller than Russia in population, in economics. They prepared for this war in years, but they can't win over Ukraine. How they could attack NATO?
You say the Russians have tried everything already, but they haven't used nuclear weapons ever. And we've been hearing this rhetoric about the Third World War, and it hasn't just been coming from Moscow. It even came from people inside the incoming Trump administration. I mean, aren't you concerned that we could be about to enter an extremely serious phase in this conflict?
As I told you, I think this is a bluffing. And if Russia will go nukes, that will be the end of Russia itself and the end of physical life of people like Putin, Lavrov, and others. So I don't believe they would ever do this. Also, don't forget that Russia is not alone. They are part of this axis of chaos. China, North Korea, Iran, and all these countries, they are also afraid of any nuclear war because that will be the end. So I don't believe in all this bluffing from Russia that they will do something special. We heard it many times. If Crimea would be attacked, if Crimean Bridge would be attacked, if something else would be attacked. Ukraine is not using nukes. Russia can't use nukes either.
You mentioned North Korea. 10,000 North Korean troops reported to have been deployed to the battlefield. I'm just wondering what sort of a difference they're making.
For the moment, I can't say they're making some difference. It definitely shows the global character of the conflict, where North Koreans are in Europe, probably fighting with Europeans. But it's not still clear how Russia is using these troops, how actively they're going to use it, or they want to use it as an auxiliary troops to free Russian units, whether they want to use it on Russian-Ukrainian border, or they want to use them inside Ukrainian territory. We just don't know for the moment. But definitely they are in Russia. That's something we do know. And we know that they're very close to frontline, and there were already occasions when they were involved in the hostilities. That's what we know for the moment, and we are closely following the development of the situation.
Today is, of course, an important milestone in the war. 1,000 days since the Russian invasion began. And today you were on X, also known as Twitter, and you said, quote, Putin wanted to take Ukraine for himself quickly, but we're still resisting. Just tell us, what is the situation on the battlefield? How is Ukraine doing 1,000 days into this war?
Much, much, much better than everybody in the world predicted, including Putin, who was saying that Russia will end with Ukraine in 2-3 days, okay, in 2-3 weeks. As you see, it's already 1,000 days. Ukraine is not finished, even more. Ukraine succeeded to liberate parts of occupied territories. There is no one regional center which was taken by Russia during this invasion. Yes, it's very difficult for us, a lot of victims. Russia occupied part of our territory, additional part, plus to what was occupied in 2014. So altogether, near 20% of Ukrainian territories is occupied, which is very painful for us, but Ukraine is alive. And Ukraine is candidate now to European Union member, and I'm sure we will be. And the Ukrainian army is today, I think, one of the strongest armies in the world, together with the United States and Russia. I agree, Russian army is also strong because of what their battlefield experience, but Ukrainian army also. So we are clearly not in the catastrophe. We are resilient, and we're not going to lose.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Alexei Goncharenko.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the US President-elect Donald Trump has said he is willing to make use of the military to deport migrants in large numbers. While taking to social media, he indicated that he would declare an emergency and use military assets to carry out mass deportations. Well, the issue of immigration has become an increasingly important issue and a leading cause for concern, dissent and debate within the United States. Let's take a look at some numbers for you. The US is home to 1/5 of the world's international immigrants. About 11 million undocumented immigrants live in the United States, making up 3% of the country's population. Well, as of 2022, unauthorized immigrants made up 23% of US foreign-born population in 2022, higher than when Trump was president back in 2019. Well, the president-elect built his campaign on the foundations of immigration reform, repeatedly promising his supporters to mobilize the National Guard and aid the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, known as ICE, to carry out deportations. Well, for more, we're joined now by Ronald Vitiello, a former ICE director who was also the chief of Border Patrol during the last Trump administration. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The incoming Trump administration says it's going to declare a national emergency and use the military to carry out these mass deportations. Is this really a national emergency?
Well, we've just gone through a crisis about the last 4 years with unprecedented illegal entries at the southwest border. At the peak, 10,000 people a day were crossing the border illegally. The government itself, the DHS itself, has said that 85% of those people have been released into the country, so they now live amongst us in every city and town in America. We're also faced with a terrible opioid crisis across the country in which hundreds of thousands in the last 2 years of Americans have died or been poisoned by this deadly fentanyl. So it has been an emergency for the last 3+ years. And so a correction needs to occur. I support the president's idea that we need to fix the border, stop the leak and stop the chaos at the immediate border, at the southwest border, but then repair and fix the security situation in the rest of the country. And that will require more than the organic assets that ICE and the DHS have at their disposal now.
So who should be most concerned about this development? Who's at the top of the list for deportation?
Well, the president has been very clear that criminals and threats to public safety would be at the top of the list for targeted enforcement, immigration enforcement in cities and towns all over the United States. So those with convictions, those who are wanted in other countries, those who have run afoul of the law in the United States, the worst are going to go first.
How many will we be talking in that case?
I've seen open source reporting in the press that there's 8+ million people on what the government calls the non-detained docket. That's 8 million people who are in the country and they have no status and they need to see an immigration judge. Some of them have already been ordered removed. And in that ordered removed category, there are 1.5 million people who have some sort of criminal involvement or a criminal record. They're either wanted somewhere or they've committed crimes that make them ineligible to get relief from an immigration judge in the United States. So at minimum, there's 1.5 million people who are in the country illegally and have also committed crimes in the communities and towns that they live in.
Okay, according to the American Immigration Council, deporting 1 million people would cost more than $960 billion over the period of a decade. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. Is it worth it?
Well, there's been times in the history of the United States. I heard yesterday that when Barack Obama was president, he managed to deport almost 4 million people in his first term. And so, yeah, I mean, it involves logistics, it involves employees, it involves salaries, it involves detention, it involves airplane flights to repatriate people and take them back home. And so, yeah, it's expensive, but it also minimizes the impact all over the country of lowering wages, of our school systems that are overburdened, our cities and towns that don't have enough properties to rent. So there is a net benefit in the security of the United States, first and foremost. And then it helps in some of these other areas as well. And so, yes, it might be expensive, but you are paying for national security along with border security.
Let's talk about this mass deportation program. It's supposed to begin on the first day of the new Trump presidency, but can it really get started on day one? Because, of course, there's due process, isn't there, for each case to be considered really on a case-by-case basis?
Well, all operations of the government require a will from the commander-in-chief to support the front line. Right now, as we speak today, in many of the large cities in the United States, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement removal officers, are out looking for the worst of the worst. They're looking for people who have run afoul of the law in their own community and are also in the country illegally. And so they can take the handcuffs off. They can prioritize those activities while a plan is being written, while a plan is being coordinated, while the logistics are put in place to scale up their work. There's about 150 of those officers in the United States, but there's nearly 20,000 immigration officers in ICE. And so you can reallocate the existing resources in ICE, perhaps get some help from the Department of Defense, and use the state and local cooperation agreements that exist today and enhance and improve those along the way. So starting day one, they can prioritize this activity and add resources as the plans are written and operationalized.
Okay, but I mean, obviously there are going to be legal challenges, and that's going to hold the process up because obviously due process can't be completely disregarded. But then not just legal challenges, there's also going to be logistical challenges. I mean, there's talk of large-scale detention camps being built, tents being built. I mean, all that's going to take a huge amount of time, isn't it?
Well, there will be a time factor into when they can get it to scale. But as it relates to the legal factors, that 1.5 million criminally involved aliens are in the country, and many of them have already been ordered deported by a judge. They are already on the path for removal. They're just not in government custody to go ahead and repatriate them back home. And so the law is very clear. It's against the law to cross the border illegally without being inspected and stay in the United States. It's also against the law to work while you're illegally in the United States or to be hired by an employer. Employers can be fined for similar things. And so the legal footing that the president will stand on for targeted enforcement against the worst of the worst, and then scale up to the 20+ million people that are in the country illegally. The law is very clear on status there. And there is a due process element. And I would just say in the last 3.5 years, the government has spent billions of dollars in caring for people who are in custody when they rush the border for the last 3.5 years. There are facilities, there are about 8 facilities across the U.S.-Mexico border on the U.S. side that temporarily hold people before they're released in the United States. One of those large facilities in the El Paso area cost $1 billion a year to run. And so we're already spending enormous amounts of money for the flow that is occurring today. If you stop the leak and repurpose those facilities, you could scale this up fairly quickly.
But I mean, talking about cost again, I mean, the costs, really go into the stratosphere at a certain point, because we've talked about the cost of deporting 1 million people, and that would be somewhere in the region of 960 billion. Donald Trump says there are between 15 and 20 million people who could be drawn up on a list for deportation. I mean, just doing the maths, I mean, even if it's 10 million, which is what Pew Research says it is, the number of people who could be deported, we're talking about 10 trillion US dollars. I mean, does the United States even have that kind of money? Because last time I checked, it's about a third of national debt.
It's going to be expensive. They're going to require resources. But I will just tell you that when we had the largest surge at the border of its time in 2014, when Barack Obama was the president, again, they were deporting hundreds of thousands of people every single day. When he asked career people like me to fix the problems at the southwest border, we put a number of steps in place to deter people from leaving home and trying to come into the United States, because we ended the incentives. If you end the incentive to be in the United States illegally, many people will elect to go home by themselves. You'll remember that when Donald Trump became the president in 2018, there was a mass exodus from the United States into Canada of people who were illegally in the country and were fearful of being deported and removed by the U.S. government, and they fled to Canada. So some people will elect to go home to stay out of immigration detention, to stay out of the logistics chain, the pipeline, to be returned home. And so it's not just government agencies going out and putting hands on every single of the 20 million people that have come into the United States in the last several years. It will also be able to verify departures of people who wish not to stay under the conditions in which they can't find a job, that if they get arrested by local authorities, they're going to be immediately referred to ICE for removal, and then a concentrated effort to find the worst of the worst across the United States.
But we're talking about some people who, for example, like the Dreamers, who came to the United States as children. I'm just wondering whether they'd be concerned by sweeping deportations, and whether the DACA legislation brought in by the Obama administration, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, whether that would be scrapped. What's your understanding of what would happen to those people?
Well, DACA is not law in the United States. It was a function of the executive branch. The president authorized the Department of Homeland Security to defer deportations for people that fell in that certain category. The Supreme Court has ruled that action to be illegal. Trump tried to end it in his first term. He tried to end the program and enrollments in the program in his first term. It was pushed back by the courts, and the courts didn't weigh that case on the merits. So it's not immigration law. But if we're starting with the worst of the worst and we're prioritizing the existing assets that DHS has now to focus on threats to public safety, it'll be a long time before we get to a place where somebody that's been in the country for over a decade will be on a path for removal.
And just lastly, tell us a bit about how you envisage your role being in the new Trump administration. And by extension of that, do you envisage more sections of border wall being built during Trump 2.0?
Well, I'm not a government employee now, but yes, I think that there are some unfinished portions of the border in which material and contracts were let to build a border wall that will be reinstated. We've learned a lot over the last 3.5 years when the U.S. government sued Arizona and Texas for trying to protect their own borders. And so some of the infrastructure and some of the lessons learned in those will be applied to a new regime for infrastructure on the border. So I expect that the men and women of the Border Patrol are going to have the kind of support that they've not had in the last administration, the Biden administration, and will return to someone in the Oval Office that knows what they do and wants to give them the tools that they have to succeed.
Okay, Ron Vitello, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
Now, for several months, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been critical, and now the situation has just got even worse. This after nearly 100 aid trucks were looted, marking one of the worst aid losses during the course of this 13-month-long war. Well, the convoy carrying food from the UN, UNRWA and the World Food Programme was abruptly rerouted by the Israeli authorities at the Kerem Shalom border crossing, and the looting occurred shortly thereafter. Well, the identity of the looters remains unclear. Israel is accusing Hamas, whilst Hamas claims to have killed 20 individuals that they labelled as gang members. Well, for more, we can speak now to UNRWA spokesperson Adnan Abu Hasna, who joins us from Cairo. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Just tell us a little bit more about what happened in Gaza with those looted food aid trucks.
We have lots of food aid actually waiting at the crossing point of Kerem Shalom. Suddenly, the Israeli authority told the UN organization that we have. It was a short notice actually, to let 100 more than 100 trucks of loaded with food and flour to leave the area of the crossing point and to use another way, another road as alternative. It's not the usual road. And suddenly, after moving the trucks, towards Khan Yunis and the middle area, as usual, armed gangs, jumped over, the trucks and forced the drivers to stop, and more than 100 trucks had been looted.
Who should carry the responsibility for this? Because, of course, aid trucks are supposed to have securities surrounding them. I mean, whose obligation is it to provide secure passage to that convoy?
In the past, the civil police used to protect, the convoys, but they were hit and they were targeted, and many of them were killed. And even, some groups tried, to arrange a kind of protection, but also they were forbidden, from doing that, and also they were targeted. We believe it is the responsibility of the occupying power. It is the responsibility of Israel, as it is really occupying Gaza. It is the reality, there. They have to protect the convoys until it reaches, to the needy people. Otherwise, leaving things like that to gangs, armed gangs, many people now, many gangs in Gaza, that specifically that area, and east of Rafah and Khan Yunis, they are all the time looting what we bring in. Now we are talking about two kinds of, or two elements joined together and, pushing for the starvation of Gaza. The amount of food that entering Gaza is very little. And after that, if we succeed to get that little into Gaza, we are shocked, or we are faced by these gangs that, controlling everything and looting everything. And 90% of the goods that we get into Gaza are being looted right now.
Yeah, I was going to say it was less than that. According to some reports, I read half the aid that enters Gaza is ultimately looted. It sounds like it's much more than that. And I'm just wondering if this is perhaps a sign of just how increasingly desperate the situation is getting in Gaza. If people are resorting to these techniques, how close to being in a state of famine are parts of the territory?
People are very frustrated. They are desperate, and they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. Actually, so now we are talking the Gaza Strip in the northern part of Gaza Strip. We are talking about some places there is famine there. No one can deny that. Even all the reports that coming out from that, they are talking about people who did not, eat for 2 or 3 days. And actually, there is nothing to eat in Jabalia, Beit Hanun, and Beit Lahia area. And we are, now watching, phenomena like that and signs of hunger in the southern part of Gaza Strip. And we believe if the disorder and the amount of food that, getting into Gaza is so little. If this continue like that, and there is no drastic measures actually to improve the situation, we will be facing 100% famine in the southern part of the Gaza Strip.
I just want to ask you about what Hamas has been saying with regards to the people it says were responsible for the looting of the aid convoy. Hamas saying 20 people were killed, calling these people gang members and warning looters in the future they'll be treated with, quote, an iron fist. I mean, do we know anything about what happened to those people that were killed and who they were?
We don't know. So, there are many rumors and many talks about that. People said that they're, living beside the fence. They are from families. They are actually thieves. No one, for us as a UN, we don't know exactly, what's going on. It is the responsibility of Israel and the responsibility of also any kind of administration, in the Gaza Strip. They have to intervene. We have to get rid of all of that. Otherwise, there will be a catastrophe in the Gaza Strip related to famine, related to hunger, diseases, and everything. It's an unbearable situation right now.
And it could get worse, couldn't it? Because UNRWA has been banned from operating in Israel. A 90-day deadline was put in place, and that was some weeks ago. So what sort of contingencies, what can be done to prepare Gaza for the post-UNRWA phase?
No, right now they did not actually implement all the laws or legislation that had been adopted by the Israeli parliament. If they really want to implement it in 90 days, I think that they are cutting off the lifeline of Gaza life. No UN organization can replace UNRWA. They don't have the capacity, the logistic, ability. They don't have staff like us. We have 13,000 staff in the Gaza Strip. We have hundreds of trucks, of cars, of installation. We have the experience. We have the data. We have, everything. Other UN organization, you are talking about organization, very small organization, regarding, related to UNRWA, like UNICEF, WFP, or WHO, talking about tens of people only, working there. So the only, body who can really deliver in the Gaza Strip is UNRWA. Otherwise, if Israel, they don't want UNRWA, the IDF can do it directly. They can, collect, all the garbage. They can be responsible for the health, for education. If they can deliver, okay, they are welcome, to do that. Otherwise, they have to leave. The only remained body in the Gaza Strip who's doing, like not only a major role, but most of the functions of the other, other UN organization or NGOs are depending on us to deliver also. So if the IDF can do the job and replace UNRWA in terms of education, health, collecting garbage, the sewage system, responsible for the sewage system, for water, for everything, they are welcome to do that. Otherwise, I believe that no other organization can deliver in the Gaza Strip.
Okay, UNRWA spokesperson Adnan Abu Hasna, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us today.
Thanks.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
We go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
If you ever have the opportunity to hold a manuscript, it will captivate you and take you to other worlds. As soon as your eyes fall upon its front page, You will stand amazed as you behold the style and method of writing present on it. Everything here is subject to rules, and writing does not stray far from this. Even the title and the basmala adhere to these rules, as well as the introduction, sections, chapters, and finally reaching the conclusion. The rigor of the curriculum is certain, as is good writing. The manuscript is divided according to its physical components, which are paper, midad, scripts, and binding. The content of the manuscript is another story. The research method is the basis of this content. After reviewing thousands of manuscripts and studying them attentively and carefully, it was found that most of them follow a similar methodological approach. The approach includes research methodology, classification, and authorship. It is a methodology that has been prevalent since the early beginnings of writing and is still present today. After the allure of the manuscript's exterior wears off, you open the cover, and your eyes will fall upon the first page, and you'll notice that it's most likely a piece of white paper. From here, you realize the first rule in the essentials of writing among the Arabs in the early Islamic era, which is to leave the first page of the manuscript blank. Nothing is written on this page, for fear of it being tampered with or contaminated due to frequent use, or perhaps some of the lines of writing become blurry. It was also placed for binding purposes, or to have plant-like decorations on it, or drawings. It is rare for manuscripts to have a specific page designated for the title. Many manuscripts have had the title page left blank. The copyists would add the title of the book and the author's name to it later on. The owner or the reader of the book may also do so. This explains the difference between the scripts and fonts that are found in the title and the manuscript itself. It is possible to make a mistake when placing the title of the book, or when attributing the book to an author. It is possible to sometimes find a preface or a prologue on the title page, or the ownership deed that includes the legal purchase details as well as the price paid for the manuscript by the buyer. On this page, you can also find the names of the witnesses who were mentioned, and many other things that have nothing to do with the author or the copyist. The introduction to the manuscript would not be without the basmala. Unless the first page or several pages of the manuscripts were missing. Some manuscripts that were written by non-Muslims would begin with the basmala, abiding by and honoring the Quran, and following the Quran's style and approach. They also praise the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, his people and followers, until the Day of Judgment, along with some prayers. When you browse through the pages of the manuscript, you will notice many writings that are found in the margins. These writings are called footnotes. After the scholars read a certain manuscript, they would write many footnotes as observations or comments. Even some of them, if collected and organized, could become a standalone book in their own right. After the doxology, the author would state, "And now." Then they would mention their name, the topic they desire to research, and the reasons that prompted them to do so. The scholar should mention their methodology and divide the manuscript into sections and chapters, among other matters that the author deems necessary. In the introduction, there is a lot of important information, such as the title of the manuscript, for example. The scholar may mention the title of another one of their works, which leads us to further know the author, if they were not already mentioned on the title page or in the introduction. The scientist may explain the subject they are researching and define its parameters. They would cite sources and references that they derived the material of their book from. The author would mention the name of their sheikhs and teachers, who they were taught by, or whose material that they had read. In the introduction, they would sometimes list the name of some of their students. When reading the introduction, we can discern what the copyist added to the manuscript. We can also find evidence or references to the date of when the manuscript was composed or classified. A summary of the material that the manuscript elaborates upon can be sometimes found. The manuscript's conclusion is no less important than its introduction or its content. It includes the information that it contained that was not found anywhere else in the manuscript, such as the title of the manuscript or the author's name, regardless of whether the author themselves mentioned it or the copyist did so. Some manuscripts may contain a phrase that indicates the completion of the text, such as, "The book is completed." In addition to the date of its completion and the sources on which the author relied on while categorizing their book. A historical event is mentioned in the conclusion, in which the copyist or author dates this copy of the manuscript. They can also include the title of another book by the author. The copyist has a way of writing the final sentences of the manuscript. They would usually be written as an upside-down triangle, with its base directed towards the top, and the top of the triangle would be at the bottom, and it was referred to as al-harda. Manuscripts have persevered and traversed through time to our current days. They were preserved and transmitted developments in the ways of writing and authorship among the Arabs. The content of their books form threads of light that still shine and glimmer to this day.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Auckland. Auckland is known as the city of many lovers, according to its Maori name Tamaki Makura, as those lovers wanted the place so badly that they fought over it for centuries. A geographically blessed city, The New Zealand capital has the appeal of a small town and the style of a modern metropolis. Auckland Museum is one of the country's most recognized heritage locations. The 84-year-old museum houses the most comprehensive collection of Maori and Pacific Islander art in the Southern Hemisphere. On display are graphic textiles, carvings, some of the war canoes, ware or the traditional Maori meeting houses, as well as other 18th and 19th century portraits. Devonport is a self-contained late Victorian neighborhood of historic sites, including North Head, a British fort dating back to 1887. There are also popular cafes and restaurants within it. Find two of Auckland's picture-perfect beaches or climb to the top of Mount Victoria for 360-degree views of the city, Hauraki Gulf, and the North Shore. Waiheke Island is a place for a quick island escape. Worth visiting are the Little Onaroa, Palm Beach, and the mile-long Onatangi. Fancy a dinner nearby with a great view of the beach. A diverse mix of gustatory pleasures, Auckland is also ideal for food trips. The city is a medley of different tastes, offering diverse cuisines from contemporary Japanese dishes to all-American pizzas to healthy Thai salads and greens. Depending on your mood, you can choose from the elegant dining restaurants, or you might prefer the laid-back alfresco cafes. Shopping also keeps the city abuzz. Specialty stores include rare and vintage finds, from the gardening books and electric furniture, fiesta dinnerware and old photographs, as well as restored goods, such as vintage wooden cutting boards, southern French crockery, and white enamel cookware. There are also classic and one-room boutiques that offer pieces for men and women, with a well-curated collection of shoes and boots to match. You may also find shops featuring own-brand clothes and jewelry for men and women, sold alongside a distinct merchandise mix of non-clothing items that reflect the owner's interests.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Honolulu, a journey that'll give you history, food trips, and adventure. But more than anything, Honolulu offers you nature at its best. One of the most famous is Waikiki, the beachfront neighborhood of Honolulu and the most touristy area in town. Occupying a long stretch of the coast on the south shore of Honolulu, Waikiki's got a strip of high-rise hotels and resorts lining the beach. Other famous spots on the historical side include the Lolani Palace, a historical landmark in downtown Honolulu, originally built in 1879. Pearl Harbor is also considered a memorial attraction in Honolulu. Meanwhile, the local Hawaiian cuisine is certainly a thing to try. Then there's a Honolulu's Chinatown for fresh produce. The busy market section of Honolulu smells of fresh fruits and veggies and meat and fish. Here you can buy produce at great prices. And finally, here are Honolulu's well-known nature trips. The Hanayuma Bay is one of the most famous places on the entire island for snorkeling. It's a nature reserve and marine sanctuary. Hiking is one of the best things to do in Honolulu. There are quite a few good hikes right in the Honolulu area. Some of them a bit outside of the city limits, but others are just right in the city. Take your pick. Then, of course, there's the Diamond Head, which is the iconic former volcano that's an emblem of travelers visiting Honolulu. People often like to take photos with it as a backdrop, but the view is in fact so much better when you're on top of it. Then there's the Manoa Falls that offers a lush green jungle hike. It's a good way to appreciate the greenery and plants and trees of Hawaii. The north shore of Oahu is also great for surfing, or try the bodyboard, stand-up paddleboard, and other ocean activities. And then there's the Honolulu Zoo that's home to 905 different animals. Along with the diversity of different animals at the Honolulu Zoo, also neatly designed with many different lush tropical gardens. And finally, the Waikiki Aquarium is a good place to learn about the marine life of Hawaii.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Guatemala. Adventure awaits at Guatemala. You can dare to explore the jungles or go on a canopy tour. The rainforests at Guatemala are perfect for thrill seekers to engage in many action-packed adventures. Guatemala is in fact known for its great outdoors. Its subtropical rainforests are protected, so people can enjoy nature-friendly activities such as hiking, biking, and horse riding. You can also hike up the Mayan pyramids. Tikal is a famous archaeological site hidden deep within the rainforest, where 70-meter or 230 feet high pyramids are seen through the canopies. It is a known UNESCO World Heritage Site that has more than 3,000 structures. And if a pyramid isn't enough for you, then you can also try hiking up an active volcano. Guatemala's Volcan Pacaya remains one of the most hiked volcanoes in the country. Molten lava slowly pours through its summit, creating huge dust and lava fields that admittedly create an impressive landscape. Also popular in Guatemala is the breathtaking Caribbean coast. You can reach it by boating along the Rio Dulce. It is a highly recommended trip as you'll get to experience a unique, isolated island feel. There, you'll arrive to hammocks and a rustic-themed beachside. Of course, you should go meet the locals. Explore the unique highlands region of western Guatemala, which is also known in Spanish as El Altiplano. Many of the modern-day indigenous Mayan groups reside there, and it's fantastic to listen to them speak in their native tongue. The locals retain the sacred rituals of their ancestors too. And you'll definitely enjoy the view of the great mountains and untouched beauty of the region's surroundings. Take a trip to the city proper. Although most tourists would rather skip the traffic-induced capital, you should still pay a visit. The place still has enticing gems yet to be discovered.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge